And yeah, that's right.
And how many years have you been coming?
So we've been working here since 2008.
2009.
When did we come in?
2009.
When was the first? We didn't come in November.
November 09.
Was it November 9?
9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 7th year.
7th year, yes.
So you just come for extended periods of time?
We basically come for 2 or 3 weeks in the Easter time before the island fills up with 2 new tourists. We have a crew of around 10 to 12, plus local volunteers. So we have students from the UK, from my department, and local volunteers, basically.
Okay.
How are we doing on time?
Well, you get 9 minutes.
Oh, no, that's plenty of time. Massive
Okay,
time.
all right.
Great.
Good. It's nice to meet you. I may have a couple questions afterwards.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll show you the artifacts afterwards. So you'll
Good. Got my camera.
I've got your camera.
Ready to go.
Fantastic. Great.
Okay. Thank you.
See you later.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? All right, well, welcome. We're really glad everybody came out tonight on a Friday night. And this is the Croatoan Archeological Society, and we're going to be presenting Professor Mark Horton here in just a minute to do his presentation about where did the lost colonists end up. I just want to do a quick, brief introduction to the CAS, our group. We started in 2009, just very grassroots. It was kind of me and my husband, who's going to come up here and talk in just a second. And this has basically been going on. This is our 7th dig this year. We've kind of been quietly excavating on Hatteras Island, and nobody's really kind of even known who we are or what we're doing. And so now we're trying to get the word out there a little bit more. But I really want to thank some people. Most importantly, the Hatteras community, who is just a wonderful place that has welcomed us and has, just shown us so much support for what we're doing. Without the community, we could not have done this. With the dinners, the donations, the fundraisers, just everything has just been so overwhelming. And specifically, I want to thank our CAS board members, who I can't tell you the countless hours and time and sweat and tears that they put into it, and our families suffer for it, and we thank our families for putting up for us. And if my kids were here, I would thank them, because they get drug around everywhere and yonder and just have to put up with it all. But so let me just mention a few people specifically. Janet Bigney with Romanthe Water Sports and Campground, who is just, without her, I don't know where I'd be. I'd be in the loony bin. That's where I'd be without her. And thank you, Mike, because you have to loan your wife to me for many, many hours and days and weeks at a time. But I love her, and I thank her for everything she does. Okay. Charles Williams with Williams Plumbing, who's out here. He's also on our board, and he has just done so much with fundraising and helping us. And his lovely wife has made us some amazing dinners as well. And I can't speak enough about these people. Warren McMaster, Roanoke Island Festival Park, is here. He's also a board member. He has been digging with us since the very, very, very beginning. And he has a passion like my husband here has. They just live and thrive on this stuff. We've got Ollie Jarvis with Dillon's Corner, who's been on the board since the beginning and has been supportive of us all along with many, many different ways. Gary Skeena of Studio 12 and Skeena's Accounting Services, who has been wonderful because he does all the taxes for us too, which is great. And some former board members, Charlie Pereira with Orange Blossom Bakery and Cafe and Sushi Sports Fishing, and John and Ronna Connor with Connor's Supermarket, who has done wonderful dinners for the crew and lunches for them for many, many years since the very beginning. So I also want to thank all the families and the CAS members who come out and volunteer their time, and they dig, and they have dirty fingernails, and they sweat, and they get the tick bites and the spider bites, but it's all worth it when you pull that one little thing out of the stitcher and you go, oh look, I found it. It's lead shot. It's an arrowhead. So thank you to all of those volunteers that come out. And Bill Brown is in here somewhere. Where is Bill Brown? Thank you. This man has been so wonderful. He he and his wife and family have been cooking for the crew these past 2 years so much. It's so wonderful, and we appreciate it very much. Okay, and to, of course, all of the University of Bristol students that have come out every year, and Doug, and oh my goodness, they work so hard. So thank you guys. Last thing I'd like to just say in memory of Betsy Clark, who came out to dig with us, came down from Virginia. It was one of her lifelong dreams to be at an archaeology dig, and she came and dug with us, and she has since passed away from cancer. And that is one of the reasons I love doing this, is she got to fulfill one of her bucket list things before she passed on. So the only other thing I'm going to say is, if everyone would just turn the sound off on your cell phones for the event tonight. And I'm going to introduce my husband, Scott Dawson, which many of you here know, and really doesn't need much introduction, but Scott, my husband, is the president of this CAS organization. I'm just the secretary, so I do the business sides of things, but he is the one who has the passion and the love for the history of the island. He's a native of the island, going back to the 1600s on his genealogy, and it's really, when you talk to him, you love the history just by listening to him talk about it. And I'm someone who never liked history growing up, and he convinced me. So without further ado, here is Scott, and he's going to present our speaker of the night.
Okay. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Like Maggie said, this started back in 2009. For decades, been finding native artifacts on the island when there was construction sites or after bad erosion, and it just gutted me to see it being, destroyed, really. And I had a lifelong dream of getting some professionals down there to take a look at it and see what we could preserve and see what we could learn. And in 2009, that dream came true. Professor Mark Horton came down with a grad student and started a very small-scale dig in 2009, doing some test bits, and we found wonderful artifacts, and each year it has grown, and now we have a full crew, and we do a large dig every year. Mark is the perfect person to have to do this because he is already an expert in contact archaeology between European and native peoples. He's dug all over the world. He got his PhD at Cambridge. He taught at Oxford. He now teaches at the University of Bristol. He brings these lovely grad students who work from dusk till dawn and never complain. He's dug I believe it was a Scottish colony in Panama, and it is very interesting to listen to him and see physically the changes that occur in native societies after contact with Europeans. So we're very, very lucky to have him come here. He does all of this for free. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mark to you. For me, it really is a dream come true to do this. So I thank him with the bottom of my heart. Mark?
Well, thank you, Scott, for those warm words, and to Maggie, and thank you all for coming here. When the original idea was that we might reveal, really for the first time in public, what we've been finding over the last 6 or 7 years here in Manteo, I thought, my gosh, that's a bit like going into the lion's den. But then I thought, well, you know, it is a joint story that has to be explained, and somehow a lot of the archaeology of what we've been finding in Hatteras, as you'll see, is closely parallel to a lot of the things that's been found here on Roanoke Island. And it is an incredible story to tell, and I hope that what we've uncovered will just rekindle national and international interest in this incredible story of the expeditions in the 16th century. So, I thought I want to start off with an image which you all know about, you live here. And of course, the story of the lost colony is well known, and it's not right, and we have far too many other exciting things to do to go into any detail, because you all know it and seen the play umpteen times, I'm sure. But to just briefly remind you that there were a number of expeditions to the Carolina coastline, sponsored by Sir Walter Raleigh, who never actually came here. And the last of that was in 1587. The settlers went to Roanoke Island, probably close to, though we don't know where, the fort that was constructed in an earlier expedition by Ralph Lane and his colonists. They were there, abandoned by the governor, John White, who left for England shortly after their arrival, and he returned to England. And then there was this problem called the Spanish Armada that intervened, which meant that he couldn't come and relieve them until 1590. And then when he arrived, courtesy of a rather dreadful diorama that was once in the visitor centre, he arrived and found the fort, or the place that they were living, abandoned, but recorded that on the palisade was written the word Croatoan, and on a nearby oak tree, probably a live oak tree, was the words CRO. There we have this. A modern rendition of the sayings, I'm sure is familiar to you all. And he, in his narrative, made it completely clear that Crow and Croatoan stood for the island of Croatoan, which we now call Hatteras Island. And if there's any doubt about this, we could have a look at one of John White's maps, which shows in great detail, and it's one of the most remarkable pieces of cartography at the time, the shorelines, the outer banks. If you think that actually we're gaining an extra point there, that's actually Wimble Shoals that was destroyed in a hurricane, near Dante now. Here we have the island of Hatteras, or marked very, very clearly on this map, the island of Croatoan. So notions that they went to live with a tribe called Croatoan, which has sometimes been promoted, is complete nonsense. They clearly went to the geographical place called Croatoan, which today is Hatteras Island. And so if we really want to solve the problem of the abandoned colonists, the lost colonists, we have to understand in detail the archaeology of Croatoan or Hatteras Island. If you read the internet and so forth, you'll see many, many mad theories about what might have happened to them, most of which is based upon absolutely no historical evidence whatsoever. So let's just keep ourselves on the science and on the archaeology and see what the archaeology tells us, because that's kind of physical and real. Okay, so one of the problems in identifying what might be described as Elizabethan material culture, and if we are to find what often one would describe as the smoking gun, if you like, of Elizabethan colonisation, one has to be mindful of the fact that there were a whole series of expeditions to the Outer Banks between 1584 and 1590, all of which spent time both on Hatteras Island and also on Roanoke Island. We have the first, the Amethyst and Barlow expedition, which was a reconnaissance expedition, and I think we're pretty certain, and most serious historians would accept, that actually that made its first landfall on Hatteras Island. Subsequently, what's known as the military colony of Grenville, Lane and Stafford in 1585, which was rescued by Francis Drake in 1586, was widely ranging throughout the Sound area. We know that because of the very detailed maps that John White compiled, and he was part of that expedition with the cartographer Thomas Harriot, a scientist and cartographer. So it seems very, very likely that they were widely ranging, and the documentary evidence for that expedition is not so good, but it would appear that they must have spent some time and possibly even built a fort on Hatteras Island before moving to Roanoke Island right at the end of the expedition, and certainly Lane in his account describes a fort that was built here on Roanoke Island. And then finally the John White colony that was here in 1588, and presumably the colonists, when they felt they were abandoned, went to, one possible hypothesis is that they went to Hatteras Island because both the Native Americans were friendly. Manteo himself was a native of Croatoan or Hatteras Island, and also it was sticking out there in the Atlantic Ocean, so it was the best prospect that they would get rescued. So to put this in a bit of perspective, that's the landscape in which they're living, and in fact this is John White's map with the famous hidden fort that the first colony group have been looking in Bertie County here, just underneath the bit of paper here that was discovered a few years ago by Greg Lane. But also what we have is a landscape, and quite interestingly, rather annoyingly, no sign of a permanent settlement as was marked on Roanoke Island, because they hadn't actually got there, they just marked a Native American settlement. But also you can see from here how the island of Croatoan is covered with native settlements. These little red blobs all represent a native village. And this is essentially where they were operating in the landscape which they know most of all. Okay, so what actually evidence do we have? And I alluded to the fact there's a comparison between what we've been finding at Hatteras Island and what has been found here. Up just on the road from the National Park Service site, Fort Raleigh, there is a fort that many tourists visit. I'm reliably informed it was largely restored or recreated by the Park Service in the 1950s and 60s, and is actually marked on a 18th century map as Fort Payne, so almost certainly is a fort originally 18th century construction rather than anything associated with the Raleigh colonists. And this was a conclusion that was confirmed by Kelso and Noel Hume in their excavations there a few years ago. So essentially the site of both Lay's fort and the lost colony is still eludes us. Harrington, who excavated the fort, however, found and around made a discovery, quite an important discovery, which he kind of described as the smoking gun of the Elizabethan presence here, which was 3 tokens minted by moneyers in Nuremberg in Germany. They were attributed to a money called Hans Schultz, and these 3 tokens were found in the soil close to the site of Fort Raleigh, and seemed to belong. Hans Schultz, you know, was issuing tokens in the late 1580s. And so this fits very well with the historical interpretation. We'll be returning to these tokens later. We then have further excavations undertaken by Noel Hume and Kelso around the fort. They demonstrated stratigraphically, fairly conclusively, that most of this Elizabethan material culture was found underneath the fort and sealed by the fort ditches. But what they did find was quite a good evidence of metallurgy, and including one single piece of copper smelted ore, and rather importantly, on display now in the new visitor centre, a triangular crucible. Now these triangular crucibles are very characteristic of German metallurgists, and they're illustrated in a manuscript written by somebody called Georgius Agricola called De Re Metallica. He actually includes an illustration of one of these triangular crucibles that would be used for assay work. And so we know that particularly the Lane expedition was deeply interested in metallurgy. The German metallurgist accompanied the expedition, a man called Joachim Gant in particular is well known. Harriet describes the sources of the copper ore that they were seeking out. And so people have basically put 2 and 2 together. Here is the ore that was being investigated, that the German metallurgists were assaying this ore the Elizabethans were deeply interested in copper at the time. Elizabethans were short of copper. And so they were deeply interested in finding new sources of this copper ore, and kind of those Nuremberg tokens, if you like, fell out of the back pocket of Joachim Ganz and his associates. Probably not, actually, because Nuremberg tokens are very well known, and literally hundreds have been found, for example, on the foreshore of London, from where some of the colony was equipped from. So that association is less good, but nonetheless it makes a jolly good story. But those three artefacts, of course, encourage National Geographic to do a wonderful reconstruction of what might have been, of which there's very little archaeological evidence at all, but who cares? It makes a jolly good picture. I think that must be Joachim Ganz himself with a long beard there. These issues of metallurgy are important, and we'll come back to them shortly. Meanwhile, back in Hatteras Island, excavations were taking place by David Phelps, who was a professor at ECU University, Eastern Carolina University, who was principally interested in identifying the sequence of Native American material along the coastal waters of North Carolina. He undertook a long career of excavations of many sites and characterising the pottery types. And he excavated on Hatteras Island a site that had previously been discovered, known as Cape Creek site. And over a period of time, between 1998 and 2000, he did 3 seasons of excavations. And in the last season, he made this very spectacular, very well-known discovery, which is a snap-on, that is the gun lock mechanism of a musket. It's been cleaned and preserved now, and we're fairly certain that this dates to the period about 1580 to 1600. We know that because if you look carefully here, what's known as the powder, the firing pan here, which is this rectangular section here, changes its shape around 1600. So, for example, the snap-ons that were found in Virginia in the 1600s all have a circular firing pan rather than a square. There are other details as well, but making it fairly certain that this dates to before 1600, and therefore would seem to be part of the Elizabethan colony. So a great deal of excitement when that was made, followed up by another discovery, which was a gold signet ring with this passant lion, this lion walking on 4 to 4 feet like this, which was clearly being heavily reused. It was probably being used as an amulet. People identify this associated with a Master Kendall who was on the Lane expedition. However, if you go through the armoury of the Kendall family, you find that their armorial code is dolphins, not lions. There was a very minor branch of the family in Cornwall that might have used lions, but I myself was completely unconvinced that association is a valid one. However, in style, it's a Tudor ring, and clearly it was lost by somebody who was very important because they had a signet ring. So whose that was still remains unclear. Whether it's maybe from either the lost colony or the Lane colony, we don't know. But to confuse the matters further, the levels in which Phelps found these remains were entirely within later deposits. Deposits that we can now date to the 1660s and to the 1670s. This, for example, is part of a horse bridle, of stylistic we know from the 1670s. They also found a lot of evidence of the working of copper, of European copper, but into these rather curious copper men like this. They also found 2 coins attributed, which can be identified to Charles II, who of course ascended after restoration in 1660. So that place, I think the coins date to 1668, something like that. So the context of both the snap-ons and the ring is about 100 years later than the find spot in which the potential origin in which they were found. And so this remained, as it were, controversial and by no means conclusive. Okay, so what have we done and where has our approach been? Well, first of all, let's look at the island today. We haven't necessarily been home researching for evidence of Elizabethan colonisation, but our approach has been to look at the whole archaeology of the island from the Paleo-Indian, the Archaic period, right the way through into the colonial period. Because that's really the only way in which you can understand how these different relationships developed and how the landscape was used and so forth. So we have a snapshot from that white map I showed you earlier from 1585 and compare it to a map in 2008. You can begin to see the broad similarities between the islands as mapped by White, and each of the red blobs represents a Native American village and the island today. And that's the island of Croatoan with the sound. In fact, the sound was in Croatoan, a little bit further down, not where the current sound is, the inlet is today. It's also worth pointing out that there was an inlet at the eastern end of the island, which we think filled in between 1700 and 1730, or thereabouts. So the topography of the island has changed a little bit since then. So you can now, as you know, drive on the island, whereas you would have to take a boat in the 16th century. Okay, so let me briefly divide the archaeology of the island, and I don't want to dwell particularly on the earlier periods, but to say that there's a long period of occupation. I think this is really important to grasp, because some people have argued that Hatteras Island was a very marginal place, a very poor place to live, it could not support a substantial population over long periods of time. Archaeology has actually said this is absolutely not the case. It had significant populations of Native Americans living there for at least the last 2,000 years, all year round, and the resources, as you'll see from the evidence, was very rich and very fertile. So there's bountiful supplies of seafood, of fish, of deer, capable of growing corn in the fields. This is a place that could support a significant population. And of course, Hatteras Island has always been there. Here's a quick distribution map of what the site actually looks like. So here we've got the island, the distribution of sites itself, all the way along the coastline. Some here at Cape Creek, and then further down at Hatteras Village. So we've been mostly concentrating at this end in the middle and late woodland periods. Okay, so I'll give perhaps a little sort of helicopter view of the landscape. The former inlet is just here. The Cape Creek site is at the end of the Rocky Rollinson Road. We also have another site called the Jeanette Creek site, which is halfway down Rocky Rollinson site. We're currently working also on the school, the Hatteras, Cape Hatteras Secondary School, very friendly and cordial relations. We've been working at Frisco, at Brigands Bay, and then there's also a whole number of sites at Hatteras Village at the far end of the island. So we start at the beginning. We could go right back into the Paleo-Indian period, where Cumberland and Crantus Points have been found, and this is an example of one that was found very close to the school. These are the first hunters that have occupied and settled in North America, or probably the first hunters that settled in North America. And the Cumberland Point is the kind of second phase of those early hunters. And of course, at that time, the sea level was much lower than it is today, during the end of the last ice age, and so the sound would have been a plain full of game, and the Atlantic Ocean would have been a few miles to the east. A very, very different landscape to what we see today, which is largely a flooded landscape from that Pleistocene environment. But we also find a number of other tools. This is a little bit later. This is from the Archaic period, the Savannah River Point, and here we have other arrowheads. We have a large number of these from various places around the island to suggest that it was almost continuously occupied. The only period that we don't have real evidence at the moment is the early woodland period, but I'm sure we'll come to find potsherds, we can do the typology, this is middle woodland netting press pottery, for example, and here we've got paddle stand pottery from the middle and early late woodland. One of the best of these late middle woodland, early late woodland sites is actually at the school, where we've been working with local school children and having enormous fun, and here we have examples of some of this, as it were, late transitional middle to late woodland pottery that we found. But let's return to the Cape Creek Genetic site, because this is kind of the action area that we think might be going on. First to say that one of the difficulties of the archaeology is that there's been major geomorphological changes. The sand has blown in and blown out, there's been a lot of erosion. I believe you have the odd hurricane, although I've never actually been here when one has come by. So the landscape is constantly being changed and reformed, and this, of course, presents a challenge to archaeologists to find the sites. So there's an awful lot of this going on, which is digging deep holes through windblown sand and finding absolutely nothing at the bottom. And so, it's a hard graft to actually try and find the sites themselves. But when you do find them, they are incredibly rich in material. The people that were living here would have been living in almost filthy conditions, which is, of course, a complete dream for archaeologists, because it's incredibly dirty and full of lovely rubbish and lovely stuff. Here we are digging stuff. You can see here we've got a nice middle layer coming in through here, and then of course we then have to do really elaborate processes to recover all this stuff. Those who've been working with us will know just how laborious and tedious it is, but we do what we can to do what we call total archaeology, which is to recover every single grain of everything. So we dry screen things first in 3mm safe. We then wet screen them using a high pressure hose. We then wet sieve it again using a fly mesh screen. Hasbro's hardware stores have run out of fly mesh screen, we've been using so much of it, as we get it down to millimetre size, and then we then take a sample of that and float it using bucket flotation methods to get all the carbonised seed remains out of it as well. So you can see that there's a huge amount of stuff that comes out, and this presents a real challenge, but enough that we can actually recreate in great scientific detail the lifestyles of the people that were living here, what they were eating, what they were doing, and these very, very precious and significant artefacts that tell us who they were. So let's just briefly mention the genetic site where we started in 2009, which produced a fascinating sequence, which is very germane to our story, even put in a slightly negative way. So here we have a classic Native American midden, what's about that deep, underneath windblown sand. You can see the black deposits here, and associated with that midden deposit, we have Native American pipes from the early 17th century. This might even be a little bit earlier, and these classic spoon-type pipes, as are known from Virginia. But in that same level also, we found this, which is a Carolyn clay pipe, probably made of Bristol actually, rather nicely in the 1640s, 1650s. And we also have another one of these little, what we think are horse fittings. And we're reminded, of course, of the horses on Oak Creek that may well be survivors from the lost or the Grenville expedition of 1585. So they seem to have horse brasses or decorative items for horses here. What's really interesting about this site is that it had what a clearly colonial English settlement absolutely on top of it. And here is an example of this. So here we actually have an English pioneer house that was built directly over the remains of these Native American occupation. So there was no break between the English settlers and the Native Americans. And if you want the date of it, rather beautifully, we've got a bit of their daub, and included in their daub is salt glazed earthenware, which dates the 1720, 1710, 1920s, and here's their brandy bottles for the same date, and here's their Vestavana stoneware of the same date. So 1700, Europeans or English people are living directly on the site that was inhabited by Native Americans who had quite a good range of European trade items with them. That was Jeanette Creek. Now we moved a little bit further down Rocky Wollaston Road to the Cape Creek site. And we've been very fortunate that the landowners have allowed us access to virtually all the entire site. So we've been able to do now 4 years of excavations at different places on this absolutely critically important site. And it's partly difficult because a lot of it's still wooded and forested, so we have to put our excavations between the trees wherever we can fit them. So here we've got one of the sites. So here we've got one of the sites that we excavated, one of the latest of the periods of occupation. It was particularly fascinating. You can see the windblown sand dune that's on top, and you can see the earlier middle layer that sits underneath it. So we think this dates to about 1680 to 1700, and it's Native American, and it's full of everything that they had. It was kind of land bounty, really. So we have, these are, for example, tidewater pipes that are being traded from Virginia, probably being made by a pipe maker known as Emmanuel Drew. But also they were seen to be quite well equipped. So this is one of the more fascinating artefacts that we found in that midden, which is the handle to a fob watch. So the notion that these people are running around with furs and not a lot else, here is somebody who has a fob watch, or certainly the key to a fob watch, that was thrown away in that deposit. So they were beginning to look quite, as it were, Europeanized, even though they're not necessarily European. I've had this, the most remarkable set of finds, which Janet discovered, magnificent in the wet city. If you look at the size, you'll immediately recognise what these are. These are sewing pins. So these are evidence that people were wearing European clothes, even though these were in manifestly native midden deposits. So they're pins, so that's actually what the midden looks like, full of shell and pipe, and I think we had about, this is the analysis, here's Rosie doing the analysis of it, something like 30,000 individual pieces of bone. She's shaking her head in agreement. She counted them all. Mostly turtle. They must have had a great big turtle massacre. But also containing lots of fish, and so forth. So here's some of the fish bone that was in that deposit. And to just remind you of one of the illustrations from John White's drawings, it shows just how full of fish the sand was at this time, and there we've got images of how the fish were being caught. Here's some evidence. This is some of the turtle bones, and then we've got deer bones from the same deposit, and then also huge quantities of bird bones. We think these are being netted from, that's Rosie's suggestion, they're being netted from migratory birds that would have come down into the wet areas of Hatteras Island and could have been collected for their food. So this is not an island where you would go particularly hungry. Here's some of the bird bone from maybe Canadian geese, we think, but we haven't done the identification yet. And shellfish. We all go have lovely time, go to the posh restaurants and have lots of shellfish, but to realise that literally the tons and tons of shellfish that were found. So here's this year's excavations of one of these middens, where Warren actually counted each individual shell, and there were 30,700 shells the shellfish, and 27,000 individual shells. These are bivalves, these are scallops. But scallops and clams and whelks and rock whelks and oysters and so forth. So you can see that we actually worked out this particular heap of shells was responsible for about 400 kilos of shellfish, something like that. So a lot of shellfish involved. People were eating very well. They're also farming, and these implements are described by John White in his account, or Thomas Harriot in his account, and these are digging hoes for cultivating gardens, as are shown in the drawings, the maize fields, and they obviously have iron, and these were used, and we find these throughout the deposits. We've found about 15 or 20 examples of these digging hoes. We know quite well what they ate, because we've excavated the odd coprolite. I will leave that to your imagination. We haven't actually had the courage yet to take it apart and actually see what's inside. I'm waiting to find a coprolite specialist who is prepared to do so. And we also have lots of flint arrowheads. This is a Jack's Reef Point, which is classically late woodland in style, and they clearly have bow and arrows, we're able to go and hunt with them, and indeed these are shown again on the John White drawings. So here we've got a society which is full of food, living there all year round. For example, our analysis of our shells showed that all the shells from all different seasons are represented in these mints. Yes, they're not just coming in the summer or the winter, but they're living there all year round. And significant numbers of people are living there as well. And by the late 17th century at least, they're wearing at least what passes for some form of European clothing. One is reminded, and I'll come back to that point a bit later. We also find, quite extraordinarily, all these bits of flint. We were rather perturbed by what they were until this year we found a whole lot more, literally hundreds and hundreds of these flints. And we think that they're probably from the south coast of England. In fact, we even find a piece of limestone that I think comes from the Jurassic coast of Dorset. And this is probably ship's ballast, which is being reworked into flints of some type or other. Rather crude implements. Hundreds and hundreds of flints have been found. Initially we thought these were just making gun flints, but actually they seem to be reusing all these pebbles from the beach that are probably coming in the ship's ballast and reusing them in all sorts of ways. So here's some of the examples of some of this reused flint. Okay, so let's take the story back a little bit into the 17th century. Here is one of the sites. Here where we've got again, we think at this point we're now in the 1640s, late 1640s, partly because somebody fortunately left us a little token behind. This is a coin weight to work out the accuracy and validity of coins. How it got there, we don't know. It's Dutch from Antwerp. And you can see the coin is meant to be testing, dated 1644, and the money who issued this coin weight issued it in 1648, 1644, and the money issued it in 1648. So that places these deposits quite nicely in the 1650s, and again we're finding lots of material culture, including these, for example, very nice tidewater pipes, maybe slightly earlier ones with wonderful designs in them. But the actual type fossil of this deposit from the post-1660s are beads. Large numbers of Venetian trade beads, little seed beads. If you look at the scale, they're tiny in size, and they only come out of the fly mesh wet sieving. And they are very tedious to find, but they provide a really good chronological indicator. So when we don't find beads, we know that we're there dating before the 1640s, 1650s. When we do find beads, we know we're there above this. These will be woven into bead mats of some type or another. But alongside these beads, we find a lot of evidence of copper. This is, for example, a copper ring. Now, as far as I know, Native Americans didn't have, or native themselves with rings. So this again suggests maybe a European practice. This is imported copper that's coming from Europe and is being used in this way. There's an example. But we have two rings altogether. There's one here, and here's another one, also from a similar deposit. They're mad about copper. We have lots of evidence of copper. This is a part of copper shaving. And we know that the Europeans, or English from Jamestown, were bringing large quantities of copper for trading with Native Americans. And some of this copper was filtering itself down to the outer banks and appearing in these settlements. So here are parts of what we think as European copper from Jamestown. The top right-hand corner is something that would have been hung as an amulet or whatever. We also find, again, hints of European dress in the copper. This is a particularly interesting find. This is an amulet, which is a copper enclosure for a shoelace, a leather shoelace. And they're very fashionable. You can date them very accurately. And they're very fashionable in the late Elizabethan and early Jacobean period. And an identical amulet was excavated by the first colony group in Fort Raleigh a couple of years ago. In fact, I think that was really the only thing they actually found in their big excavations. But an identical one as one that we've discovered on Hatteras. Again, it's not totally 17th century, but it's beginning to have that feel that we might be finding interesting stuff. And here we've got, for example, what appears to be the ferrule at the end of a lance, or something like that, again in copper, that would have been placed in the ground, and you can see the copper enclosure for it, that may be reworked and reused. And we're studying all this using XRF machinery. We've got a portable XRF here, so we were able to identify the source and identification of all this copper. It's all European copper, almost certainly. Some of it might be part of the Elizabethan venture, and some of it is probably being traded at a later date. However, suggestions, as you're beginning to see, that we're beginning to get some interesting material culture. For example, here at an early level, we've got what appears to be the base of a wine glass. If I just give you a parallel for it, nice Cabernet Sauvignon, there is an example of what it might look like. Here's a piece of window glass. This has been snipped. It's a piece of clear window glass. Unusual. Why Native Americans have window glass, and it's been snipped around the outside to have a leaded form, a leaded cane around it. Very characteristic of Elizabethan windows, maybe into very early Jacobean later. The kind of thing that you would find on the back of a ship in the lights back in like I think Elizabeth II, for example, has examples of that in its stern windows. So again, not definitive, but interesting, and kind of what's the kind of thing they'd be trading. Here's some German stoneware, again of the late 16th century, characteristic because it would have had a silver mounting on the top, and that's why it hasn't got a rim on the top there. Again, suggestive that there's beginning to get stuff that is now, we're beginning to think is 16th century date. Okay, so let's now move into a little bit more detailed excavation and have a look at the trenches. The first one that we looked at, it's fascinating. You can see we dug a 2x2 test pit here, and what we found was a hearth in the centre here, and then a whole series of post holes around it for what proved to be probably the end of a small Elizabethan or a Native American building. You can see the scale there. Not very big. And we then, in the subsequent season, expanded that excavation, so you can see the square of that original 2x2 test pit, and then went underneath and actually found that building was the last phase of a really complicated and utterly complicated palimpsest post cells. So this was the centre of where they were living. You can see literally hundreds of post cells all marked by those paddle pop sticks, which you bought from the Dollar Tree. To show where they all they were, but you can see really good evidence of occupation. This is just to give you a view of what that kind of place might be. And a few yards away, and this is really close to where both ring and the Slab points were discovered. We have this sequence, this is the sequence as of last night, before we backfill the excavation. It gives you this lovely slice through time. So here we've got the windblown sand, dating to post-1700, and then we then have a really deep deposit of this black, midden-like material. And we've got an upper level, which dates to the 1680s, very much confirming what David Phelps found on the same site, a few inches away. And then below that, we've got a level which we think is much earlier in the 17th century, because it contained none of that European material, none of those beads, for example, in the upper level. Whereas we sift through, there's a total change, and we lost the beads, and so forth, and it became much more Native American in character. And then underneath, but we've had a few pieces, a few bits of iron and things in there. And underneath, we then have a massive shell mountain that had absolutely nothing that was associated with European contact. So we think that bottom shell mountain represents the mid-16th century. The middle layer represents early 17th century, the upper layer, late 17th century. So what's being found in these levels, pre-Native American, pre-contact, well, they don't have shell beads, but they have pearls. This is a rather fine white pearl. And these rather mysterious items that I put up because I want someone to tell me what they are. They look like black pearls, although you only get black pearls from Tahiti. The Europeans the English describe black pearls being worn by the Native Americans when they arrived here. But we think there's some form of seed or something similar. We have 20 or 30 of them now, so we're going to have to go to an analysis to work out what they are. But they're clearly being used and curated in these contexts. But rather than the glass beads, they're using shell beads. So, for example, here we've got a nice group of shell beads, a very, very fine white quartz arrowhead, another arrowhead. This, I put this in maybe slightly out of context, but it's very interesting. It's a tiny piece of vessel glass, which has been reused as a European arrowhead, as an arrowhead. And you can see the shape, you can see where there's been pressure flakes along the sides here and reused as an arrowhead. So if I go back to the previous one, you can see the same idea, except here they're using a tiny piece of vessel glass. I mean, what better testament is there for European contact than a small artefact like that? This is one of the more curious artefacts that we can't yet identify, which is a piece of polished red stone that seems to have been specially curated. It contains, also found in this midden, and one is reminded of the chief of the Roanoke, who wore similar things around his neck here as a possibility of some form of decoration. Okay, so here we go. It's all looking interesting. And that was where things lay until last year. When immediately above that building, where those postcards came to build, this was found. Now, if you remember our little prologue, Nuremberg tokens, this is another Nuremberg token. It's not just a Nuremberg token, it's identical to the Nuremberg token that was found at the Fort Raleigh site. The three have been found, and in fact, an earlier Nuremberg token was also found on Hatteras Island in the 1930s. So we have 5 tokens in total, all produced by Hans Schultz, and 2 of which come from Hatteras Island, and 3 of which come from Roanoke Island. So here we have An example of that token is the other side of it, and here we have the tokens not in such good condition, which are on display in the visitor centre at Fort Raleigh. There is, I must say, a slight issue over the chronology of these tokens, and I'll get nerdy for a second to say that in fact this group of tokens, Handshake Tokens, and none of you have, one has ever been found at Jamestown. They actually, the numismatists tell me that two of them, one from Hatteras and one from Roanoke, were produced by Handshake 1 or 2, so intermediate between the two. We know that Handshake 1 replaced Handshake 2 replaced Handshake 1 in 1584, so absolutely perfect timing. The other tokens, which are from our token, and one of the tokens from Roanoke Island, is according to the numismatist Handshake 3, who was meant to be producing his tokens in the early 17th century. Now I think that the numismatists are wrong, because I cannot believe that we've got hundreds of tokens from Jamestown, but only one, which is Handshake's. Why here you have 5 tokens in the 2 places, and the only moment at which these 2 islands, Roanoke and Hatteras, are linked is during the Elizabethan colonial ventures. And so it is highly likely that these tokens all belong to the 1580s rather than the early 1600s. I must say to that, rather normally these German token makers didn't put dates on their tokens, or it would make life a lot easier. But we could go into detail. I could go into nerdy details if you want about fleur-de-lis and wedges and things, but let's leave that for another occasion. Now, next to this token was found this, which is a piece of copper slag. And we thought, aha, well, where else do we get copper slag? And here is some other examples of this same copper slag. And then, just a few inches away, this came to light. So this is an ingot of copper, what we call a plano-convex ingot. If I turn you the other side, here's the other view of it. It's kind of shaped a bit like a bun. If you remember, you have buns, flat on the top and round at the bottom. And these buns are from tapping the molten smelted copper out of a furnace and into a bun-shaped receptacle. So Native Americans don't smelt iron, so don't smelt copper. This has to be evidence of European presence, because they would have the technology and knowledge to make this particular type of copper. Next to that, we found this, which is an iron bar, which we think is a fire bar from a furnace, and you can see at one end it's been heated, it's got very, very hot. You can see one end has been moulded like this, has been in the fire. And if I go back to De Re Metallica, if you remember, I cited early on in the talk, of this manual published in 1580 of German metallurgical techniques, we have evidence. So these are the assay furnaces that are shown, which probably one was being built at Roanoke. And here's the domain. You can see there's the man with the beard, that's Joachim Gans himself with his beard. And then you can see here, this is the actual furnace operation going on, and here the furnace is tapping them out, and I think if you look carefully, just about there, you might see the buns being produced out of the furnace. So this is exactly the technology that's being employed in the 1580s in Germany, and we have one here on the site next door to a Nuremberg token. So, quite interesting. Let's now move on, because that's not all. We have a number of other mystery artifacts that have come to light from the excavations, including this. I really don't have a clue what it is. I put it up. Perhaps you might help me. Possibly part of a piece of armour, maybe. It's brass, and it has some clearly European, and contains in these early levels. We also found this, which is a piece of wrought iron, which has been twisted. And Scotland came up with a very interesting suggestion it might be a linstock, which is why you tiny wide. You can see how it has this spirally form where you widen the slow match around in order to light a candle. This is what appears to be a musket barrel that has been reused because one end has been blunted off, but might have been used, we think subsequently, maybe to remove resin from a tree. In fact, we found tree resin from the excavations, but here we have what appears to be a barrel of a musket. We have large quantities of musket balls, many of which were homemade by people. So on the left here, these are homemade musket balls, and then we've got pistol shot as well as what appears to be manufactured musket balls. So this is examples of these homemade musket balls. We've got what appears to be a lead stylus or pencil, again suggesting that people could read or write, contained in these letters. We have two star finds that I want to share with you for the first time tonight. These have come out in the last few days and are finds that are of exceptional importance for American history. The first is this. When we found it, it was heavily corroded, as you can see here, but we've been able to do emergency conservation on it. Literally fell apart in our hands. And it's an iron object. It's got an inlay of what we think might be a gold inlay, gold leaf inlay in here, with decoration on it. And if I orientate it the right way around, you can see it's got a very characteristic shape. It has a hole here which would have contained a blade that would have run down on this side, and a handle that would have gone up here. And then this is a guard that goes up here. There's a spriglet on either side here, and then another loop around the bottom that's been moved over. So I'm sorry that the picture's not very good, but this is because we're kind of on the hoof here. But on the right is a rapier from 1580, and you can immediately see exactly which bit of rapier we're coming from. And so the blade, there's the handle, here's the blade that would come down through here, there's the curving section there, and then here's the section that goes up as the wrist guard. So here we've done a little bit of work on the typology of this, and more work has to be done, but we're fairly certain that this is a rapier, Elizabethan rapier from 1580 to 1580 to 1600. So alongside, well, a snap onto 1580 is a kind of, maybe a freak find, but to find a rapier literally centimetres away from it really does strengthen the case that something really exceptional is going on here. And then just a few inches away from that rapier was found this. I think this is the world's most boring find, which is a piece of slate. And there's a bit of slate that was drilled to the side here, as you can see, it's got a nice smooth end here, and you can see it's a really piece of boring slate. At Jamestown, they found a really bit of boring slate in the well that was thrown away in 1680. It was immediately dubbed by National Geographic as America's Rosetta Stone, because on further visits to Jamestown, a piece of slate, the same slate, it's got a hole bored in the end, it would have hung around somebody's neck, and what would have happened is you would have used this as your sort of dotting, your memo book. And the Jamestown group would argue that this belonged to William Strachey, who was the secretary to the colony. The slate itself has a date of 1598 on it, suggesting it had an early use before it came out to Jamestown. It has literally layers upon layers of scrapings, and you can see here the details, and still the analysis of the slate is still going on at the moment. It's also got Algonquian lettering, or what might be the phonetic Algonquian lettering that was invented by Thomas Harriot when he was here in 1585, and is contained on this slate. Okay, so I thought we'd better go and see if we can see anything on our slate. So here is our slate, and there we can see, I haven't actually seen this projected yet, but are there some scratches there by any chance? I think there's a letter M. Can we see a letter M somewhere? Just there? I think, is it just there? and parallel lines and all sorts of things. And I think there might be a little animal or something in there, possibly. Yes, you're the first people to look at this. I only did the Photoshop about 3 hours ago, so. So you're very privileged. Clearly, it's exactly the same type of artifact, and you know, it clearly belongs to that period. And the sort of person that had a slate would be somebody who would obviously be well educated, could read and write. Perhaps in my wildest dreams, I might even think it might have been John White's slate. We're going to find the rest of it, and it will have the sketches for those wonderful paintings that he subsequently created. Anyway, I think my time is up. I just want to finish with a picture from the Visitor Centre No More, National Park, that illustrates kind of what didn't happen. I think that we're now getting maybe persuasive evidence from the archaeology. I'll get rid of that ghastly picture and go back to the previous one. Persuasive evidence that significant numbers of the colonists went from Roanoke to Hatteras Island in between 1588 and 1590. They might initially have set themselves up with a surveyor's camp, a fort maybe on the island, but rapidly, I suspect, order and discipline was broken down and they moved into the local community. And over a long period of time, assimilated into that local community, married into that local community, and also responsible for all this, as it were, material culture, maybe retaining European dress, maybe for several generations, maybe reading and writing for several generations, and maintaining the material culture that they would have brought from Roanoke Island, the rapiers, the muskets, the musket balls, and so forth. And then finally, around 1680, much of this material was so out of date, 100 years old, that it was then discarded as no longer useful as fragmentary. So when John Lawson came by in 1701, his testimony was absolutely to be trusted. That he was arguing, he recorded how the Hatteras Indians claimed that they were descended from the English who had been partaking from the colony in Roanoke and had come to Hatteras Island, that they could read by the book, or their forebears could read by the book, and that in every detail he seems to be accurate, and this seems to have been fully borne out by the archaeology. So I think it's a very persuasive story, and we have a lot more to do to discover more evidence and to confirm what is there. But the circumstantial evidence, there's no one single smoking gun that proves that we found a lost colony, and I don't think there ever will be. But what we have done, I think, is produced kind of overwhelming circumstantial evidence that at least some of the colonists lived out their days on Hatteras Island, and they're still probably to be found there in the descendants today. Thank you very much. Right, so now we have a little treat for you. We're going to expose the finds. So don't touch them, please. But we've got some of the things you've seen and some of the things that we haven't seen. So feel free to wander around and have a look at all the material and all the objects. And maybe we could have a kind of an informal discussion. If anyone has any burning questions, or maybe come and talk to me privately. Thank you very much. Do you want to ask some questions? Oh, yes.
Wondering, what was it that initially caused your interest in becoming a Hatteras Island to do this research?
Well, yes, I've been, first of all, I'm interested in pioneer settlements. I've done some work on Bermuda, in Panama, as Scott alluded to. We work in East Africa as well. And it just struck me, I'm a West Country person. Bristol is the capital of the West Country. This is a West Country story. and it seems to me that it was a fascinating story to tell. I'm actually president of Bideford 500, which I think is twinned with Manteo, and we've been, obviously working to try and revitalise Bideford, which is one of the poorest towns in Britain. And so I was very interested in exploring this story. No. My personal view is that DNA is a particularly great area. That it is not really going to solve any problem at all, because to, first of all, trace genealogically direct descendants from colonists to present-day people, yes, is impossible historically. People in the West Country were continuously coming and settling in this part of North America, and so to provide a DNA connection, it could have taken that could have happened in the 18th century or the 17th century, rather than the 16th century. So to create, as it were, a specific DNA connection is going to be impossible to prove in any satisfactory way. So my view is that the people that are trying to do this using DNA are kind of pursuing a bit of a red herring. Right.
Talking about roughly a 3-year period, 1787 to
1587, 1590, yes?
1587, 1590. Nobody there, and I have a card.
Yes.
And they're familiar with Hatteras. Why didn't he look in Hatteras?
Well, that's a rather sad story. He sailed by Hatteras and he took soundings, believe it or not, on the Diamond Shoals, and he saw smoke coming from the island. But it didn't occur to him that they would have gone to Hatteras, gone to Croatoan Island. So he sailed by to Roanoke, and then found the message, and then he had the most blazing row with the captain of the ship, who said he wasn't going to sail back. The weather was closing in, there was a storm, it was going to take him far too long to sail back, the wind was blowing the opposite direction, and after all he wanted to go with a bit of privateering anyway. And so he didn't go back and check. It's one of the great treasures of history, really. I mean, his daughter and granddaughter were there, and it's kind of one of those sort of heart-rending moments. He tried, we think, on other occasions to mount an expedition to come back, but never could raise the finance. And by this time, Walter Raleigh himself was uninterested and was hunting for El Dorado. Well, quite. I think one of the real interesting stories is the story of assimilation. That the English colonists clearly got on with the Croatoan Indians in an interesting way, and created a pattern of assimilation. The story at Jamestown was very, very different. The policies, the way in which the Jamestown settlers dealt with the Native Americans was much more aggressive, less cooperative. And that's essentially set the pattern for subsequent Native American English relations for the next 200 years. If the Elizabethan model had won out with a much more humanistic attitude, and people like White and Harriet were deeply interested in Native American culture, they drew them. Harriet's account is one of the great landmarks of early ethnography, of understanding Native American customs and procedures. It's an extraordinary account. And maybe the whole history of America would have been very different.
When they originally found the red storm, the colonists asked where it came from. We were referred to the armory people.
Yes, that's right.
I thought that it was, they decided that it was arranged from a Drake's earlier voyage. And since I think finding that I from Drake's expedition, could not that hill also be from that time period? Because it's also tight. I can ask.
Well, yes, I mean, it's possible. I mean, it's also tight. Of course, Drake also stopped by, and there was a set of drawings in Drake's book, it was a Pierpont Library volume, isn't it? That actually is a drawing of a Hatteras Indian as well in one of Drake's accounts. So, yes, absolutely, there's a possibility there. I'm not sure how that would explain the token and the...
No, I was just about that particular item, and then as you said, I've been told that the ring was, they had found that the ring did belong to a specific sailor on one of their sailors.
Well, unlikely. I mean, first of all, a sailor would have a gold ring, yes? Well, yeah, the problem is a lion pattern is a very, very common heraldic device. You can, there's a cherry pick and say it might be this or it might be that. I'm not convinced that we know for certain who it is. Yeah. No.
What were the burial customs, either among the natives or the Europeans, or any prospect of any bones who were in any of these sites?
Well, yeah, some of these sites do have some evidence human remains, but I mean, effectively, maybe if one found a Christian supine burial, that might be possible evidence. It's very difficult, and you know the likelihood of finding burials over this time is so remote. I mean, it might help, but on the other hand, it might not be, definitive. I mean, that's what people, the dream scenario is, digging up somebody buried in a Christian way. But nobody's found one either here or anywhere else.
Is there still a large area that you're over the Minion, you still have many years more to go? There's so much to look at down there?
Yes. There's a lot. I mean, it's also very much under threat from development and housing and so forth, and people building houses, and obviously, the worst thing is not the houses, but the septic tanks that do huge amounts of damage, and they sterilise not just a septic tank, but not quite sterilise, that's the right word, but a huge area around, and of course, all this is on private property, privately owned land, and so, to some extent, we have to respond to development pressures as much as we can.
How long did this go on?
No, we're just here for 2 weeks, 2-3 weeks. Yes. So we can't really spare much time. I mean, the funding of this is very limited. It's a community archaeology. So an excavation project like this costs quite a lot of money to do. So anyone, yes, please, $10 as you go out. Hi. Yes. Generally, yes. They're quite interesting. These pipes were produced in Virginia, we think by Emanuel Drew or maybe others, and they were being made probably for the Indian market specifically. So we find kaolin pipes as well, but these were being being made as copies of English pipes, but were decorated presumably to appeal to Native Americans. Yes. There's some similarities to some of the stuff found on the pottery, but not totally. It's counted. Great. Right. I think it's time to see show and tell, isn't it?